Halo semuanya, kembali bersama saya Sandy di sini. Dan kita tadi setelah mendengarkan dua sesi yang sangat luar biasa. Jadi kalau misalnya saya boleh recap dikit, si Bayam menceritakan bahwa ada sedikit permasalahan di dunia sains. Karena dengan data yang sama kita bisa dapat hasil yang sangat 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 berbeda. Itu salah satunya dan masih ada banyak lagi yang dia bicarakan di slide tersebut. Nah, lalu si Mim bicarakan bagaimana kita bisa menghindari permasalahan tersebut. Salah satunya dengan menggunakan praregistrasi, di mana sebelum kita melakukan analisis ataupun kadang-kadang sebelum kita kumpul data, kita tulis aja, oh plan kita kira-kira apa gitu. Jadi kita tahu bahwa saat mereka melakukan analisis, melakukan statistical test, hypothesis testing, bahwa itu yang sebenarnya sudah direncanakan. Tapi kalau misalnya udah dapat data, terus tiba-tiba ada ide, like, oh sebenarnya bisa dianalisis seperti ini. Ya nggak apa-apa, asal kita label dengan sangat jelas, yang mana yang sudah di praregistrasi, yaitu confirmatory, yang mana yang exploratory. Yang saat itu kita sedang explore, kita dapat ide baru, kita lihat datanya, kita punya cara analisis yang baru atau seperti apa gitu. So it's completely fine if we continue to make new ideas. Cuman dibikin jelas yang mana yang confirmatory, yang mana exploratory. Juga ada beberapa announcement nanti. Setelah selesai kita akan membuat notes, kami akan membuat poster. Nah, kita sebenarnya mendapatkan banyak sekali support dari berbagai organisasi. Contohnya, hari ini sempat ada kemungkinan ada kerusuhan, oleh sebab itu ada throttling. Oleh sebab itu kami disupport dengan secara luar biasa oleh Mulvard VPN. Mereka berikan kita 50 VPN account secara gratis agar kita bisa melewati throttling tersebut untuk tetap melakukan webinar ini. Dan itu sangat-sangat luar biasa. Satu lagi adalah UNSW Science dan UNSW Psychology. Mereka berikan kita dana untuk printing poster yang bersangkutan dengan hasil dari webinar tersebut. Jadi misalnya tentang pre-registration, tentang registered report, kita bisa print poster dan kita bisa tempel agar kita ingat terus di ruangan fakultas ataupun di gedung universitas kita masing-masing. And so if we're gonna make those available, if you want to print them, nanti ada prosesnya dan semua biaya printing itu bakal ditanganin sama UNSW Science, UNSW Psychology. Dan just to reiterate again, ini bukan poster film, tapi ini poster yang tunjukin how to do science better, how to do science well. Nah, saya sangat-sangat excited karena kita akan ada pembicara ketiga dan pembicara tersebut lebih dekat kita secara geografis dan memang di time zone yang mirip dengan kita, yaitu Virginia atau Ginny Barbour. Dan Ginny Barbour adalah guru besar bidang etika, penelitian, dan integritas akademik dari Queensland University of Technology, di Australia, dan Direktur Australasian Open Access Strategy. Beliau adalah seorang dokter dan mendapatkan gelar dokternya dari University of Cambridge, dan itu sangat luar biasa. Tapi dia juga ambil PhD, gelar doktornya dari University of Oxford. Virginia adalah salah satu dari 3 editor yang mendirikan PLOS Medicine dan terlibat di banyak aktivitas yang berkaitan dengan akses terbuka, penerbitan ilmiah, dan etika penelitian. Dia adalah seorang yang sangat luar biasa. Jadi mari kita sambut dengan hangat Ginny Barbour. Ginny, are you there with us?
Yes, I'm here. Hi, thank you very much.
No worries. How are you doing today?
Very good, thank you. Thoroughly enjoyed the 2 previous talks.
Absolutely. It's lovely to have you with us. Is everything all set? Are you ready to go?
Yep, I'll just share my slides.
No worries. That sounds great. All right, everyone. Mari kita sambut Ginny dengan sangat hangat dengan tepuk tangan. It's all yours, Ginny. Wonderful.
Great. So I hope you're seeing that okay. Well, look, first off, I just want to say thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak on this webinar. It's a tremendous privilege. I think it's the largest webinar I've ever spoken on, and it's just tremendous from the point of view of being in Australia and being able to first of all, to talk to people, close geographically to us, but also, to be involved in something like this, which is, I think, such a tremendous initiative. So thank you for all the organisation that went into it. I'm very appreciative of that as well. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you primarily about open publishing practices. And I obviously, as with Brian and Samin, my slides will be available afterwards, and I'm really happy to take questions as we go through or at the end. So I thought I'd just start off by talking a little bit about the group that I run, which you may not have heard of, but I won't spend too much time on it. But I really want to kind of give you a bit of an idea of how it can be, how groups like this can be important regionally to really drive change in open scholarship more generally. So we're a group of 19 universities in Australia, and we work with the New Zealand universities, and we also work with Creative Commons Australia and Toa Toa, which is the equivalent to New Zealand. And we do a range of activities, advocacy to funders and government. We collaborate, we do much collaboration regionally, but also globally. We work with a lot of groups internationally. We do a lot of public outreach. That includes, for example, radio interviews, and I've done some podcasts this year, which has been great fun. And then we do capacity building, particularly of our member institutions. And obviously everything that we have is open for you to look at, and I'd very much encourage you to have a look and let us know if there's anything you'd find interesting. I'm always very keen to know about best practice elsewhere. So I'm going to cover 4 things, and then I hope we'll have good time for questions. I want to talk about some really important definitions that we have when we talk about open scholarship, open access, and how it's important to be quite precise about what we're talking about. I'm going to talk about metadata, which is one of my favorite topics. I think there's a lot of people globally who find the idea of metadata very important, and it underpins really many of the things that we talk about in the whole new world of open scholarship and good science. And in fact, even the discussion from Samin about whether or not registrations have a DOI is a perfect example, really, of why metadata are really important and how they can help us make research better. I'm going to talk about changing incentives, and again, that is something that both Samin and Brian talked about, and how that's really important. And then I feel very lucky because I do get to give you some good news at the end, which is talking about how all of these new practices that are now coming online are actually good for your research and good for researchers, and I'll show some evidence of that. So first of all, let's talk about from free access to open scholarship. Well, I'll give you the example of Australasia, and this is a graph that I drew earlier this year. And the first thing I really want to say is that if you look right down here back in the early 2000s, there've been a lot of conversations on open scholarship for a very long time. Now, this doesn't even take in what's happening internationally, but you can absolutely see that right back in the early 2000s, the Australian National University was doing work with having a university repository. At Queensland University Technology, where I'm based, it actually had the world's first open access policy for a repository, so that was in 2003. And since that time, we've had governments, both in Australia and New Zealand, supporting repositories, for example, as primary ways of making research open. We have some really important bodies that have been involved in open scholarship. So the ones that I've highlighted here are the Council of Australian University Librarians and the Council of New Zealand University Librarians, who have led in this direction. And then in green, a little bit further on, we have the Australian Research Council and National Health and Medical Research Councils developing policies, which they then revised later on. But towards the end of this arrow, what you can see is that there's now the Australian government is beginning to get involved, and the Productivity Commission is a government body. The government itself, in fact, the House of Representatives, which is our lower house of Parliament, had an inquiry into one aspect of this last year. And of course, we had an election in Australia earlier this year, and we did some work. We, as in my group, the Australasian Open Access Strategy Group, did some work on advocating to government on that. And all of these have been really valuable opportunities to talk about open access, open scholarship, and the benefits of it to a very wide audience. And what I want to just highlight down here in this red box is this is also now being tied into initiatives on the quality of research. So this is exactly the work that Brian and Samina were talking about, which is that all of the practices that we've heard about earlier on are tied almost inextricably into some form of making research open along the life cycle, and that's become a topic of intense interest to here in Australia, these very senior bodies, and I'll return to that a little later in my talk.
Sorry, Jeannie, do you mind if I ask a quick question?
Absolutely.
Yep, just to clarify for all of us, what do you mean by number one, open access, and number two, these repositories?
I will come onto that in a moment.
Okay, no worries. Yeah,
Can I
thank
come
you,
on to
Jeannie.
that? Maybe I should have done that first, but I'll show you exactly what I mean by that. Thank you for the
Thank you.
question. All right. So I'll preface it by saying that, first of all, we're thinking about open scholarship as a long-term aim. So I'll define open access and free access in a moment. But what I'd like you to hold perhaps in your, just to think about immediately, is that we actually don't make things open or free just for the sake of it. Because we now virtually always share our research electronically, whether that be the data, whether that be the publications, we absolutely have the ability to have an interconnected global system of research. So the research that I do in Australia could affect research elsewhere, and it's very clear that research that is done in one place affects the practices elsewhere. And so the research that one person does today and how well, for example, they curate their work, by which I mean the type of the way that Samin was talking about the registration is an example of curation. How well that is done has a long-term effect on how well your research is finally able to be part of this scholarly ecosystem. Okay, so what I might do is quickly let me go to this one, and then I'll go back to my previous slide. So let's talk a bit about open and free access. So often when we talk about open access, some people actually mean free access. So free access means that one can just simply read a copy of an article. Now, that might be online, or it might be a PDF version of an article. But full open access means that you also have reuse rights associated with that, and that is those are defined by what's known as a license, and the most common of these are Creative Commons licenses, and that's what this symbol on the left shows, and I'll talk a little bit more about those later. But it also means that the authors have the right to retain the copyright to the work, and they have the right to be attributed. So they're noted as the author of that work, and that's very important long term. And then also we have permanent archiving, and that can either be through a journal, or it can be the kind of repository that I was asked about just now. So let me just go back to the previous slide, because what we already have right now is a very complex world of publishing. So some of these have been mentioned in the previous talks. So registered reports, protocol registration, registering of clinical trials were actually happened before registered reports. We now have examples of publishing such as preprints, and I'll talk about that in a moment. We can have revisions to research both pre and post publication. We have this world of postprints, which is often sometimes called the author-accepted manuscript, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And then even after publication, we have the publications are not static. We can have review post-publication. So all of this is making publishing much more complicated perhaps than it was originally, and is something that, you know, when you're thinking about publishing nowadays, has to be factored into your decisions. Okay, so let me just quickly, skip over the next slide. All right. Okay, I've talked about this. So I talked about what open access, well, what about if we were to go beyond open access to something that is even more interoperable? So up at the top here, we have the free to read, which is just that you can look at a PDF. You add the Creative Commons rights, and then you have this, the author retaining the copyright, this permanent archiving, and then it becomes very clear. You can know what you can do with this research, who you can share it with, and how you can reuse it. And then there's a concept which is now becoming increasingly important, which is this concept of FAIR. And what this stands for is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And I'll define that again in the next slide as well. And what that means really is that instead of just having perhaps a free to read PDF version, a sort of print type version of an article, you have research in a format that is interoperable, so data in a format that it can be fully reused, but it also has these really key identifiers down here. And the two ones that are most important that I will talk about in more depth are these persistent identifiers of both objects, so the digital object identifier, and the persistent identifiers of individuals, which is an ORCID identifier. And then these are linked together with other really important pieces of infrastructure. And that leads to a fully, not just human readable research, but machine readable research. And as we know, most of the discovery and the searching that we do nowadays for research is not hand searching in journals. We're doing sophisticated searching via the internet. And so it's very important that we make our research as discoverable as possible, and the key part of it are these extra identifiers that lead to work being fully fair. So again, what does this look like in a bit more detail? What does at the publishing life cycle? It looks a bit like this. So I'll walk you through this diagram because I think it's really important to help think about how we actually what are all the stages of publishing. So of course it's getting more complicated because of the pre-registration, but I'm talking here primarily about the publishing of a particular article. So let's start with what it looks like when you submit an article to a publisher. So the version there is the preprint, and we know that that is an increasingly common way of sharing research, and there is indeed an Indonesian preprint server, which is fantastic to see, that can make research open at this very early stage. Then you have this process of peer review at a traditional journal. And once the article is accepted for publication, it's then called an accepted version or an author-accepted manuscript, the AAM, or the postprint. All of those really mean the same thing. And these are the versions that go into university repositories. And this is sometimes called green open access, although I prefer to use repository-based open access because it's clearer what we're talking about. And then after publication, after acceptance by the publisher, then obviously papers will go through a process that of copy editing, typesetting, putting it into a journal format. And this is the published version, the version of record. And this is the version that goes online at the journal site. And this is open access at journals, and there are many thousands of open access journals now. But as Sandy said, for example, I worked at the Public Library of Science and PLOS Medicine. The PLOS journals were some of the earliest open access journals that were around. It's also just worth noting that there are, of course, ways to deposit data and to deposit code, and these are becoming increasingly important, particularly for more complex research. I won't spend too much time going into those, but those are equally important in research if that's part of what you're doing. So I just want to have a little bit of a think about how the new models can become integrated into publishing, and how they can really change an entire model really of publishing in a way that was perhaps really quite unexpected. So I'm going to talk about preprints. So this is a really interesting graph that from a group called for ASAP Bio, which has done a huge amount of work in sort of monitoring, promoting, and really explaining the value of preprints in research. And if you look back down here in the early 2000s, there was really only one main place where you could submit preprints. There are some other smaller ones, but I'm not going to talk about those ones in great depth. The primary one here that this is tracking is something called arXiv, which is a physics preprint primarily, but does take some other somewhat related types of research. And this was before 2007. arXiv was really the only sort of substantial preprint server that was available. And then the next really big thing that happened was in 2013, and that was when bioRxiv was launched. Now, bioRxiv is a preprint server that is managed by Cold Spring Harbor Press, so that's a very important and very well-known public publication venue, and that has had great reputation. And you can begin to see after 2013, just before 2014, the area in green, that really bioRxiv was the primary driver of this enormous increase in preprints. And this is a global increase. We've seen this if you look at where these preprints are coming from, although it is undoubtedly the case at the beginning it was really mainly the US, it's now the case that it's global. And from 2014 onwards, we began to see preprint servers also in many different specialty areas. And so these aren't all noted on here, but you'll probably be familiar with ones in social science, in paleontology, in pretty much any discipline now has its own preprint server. And in fact, bioRxiv in 2019 has launched a medical archive, which I think will potentially see the same type of growth. So these are the technical parts that were put in place to really make preprint servers become available to everyone. But then some really important things happened which changed the adoption of them. And this is what I'm just going to note. So what happened here was that at first journals began to agree that it was acceptable to put your early article in a preprint server, and they would not regard that as being prior publication. And that was a very important step for acceptance for both funders, for institutions, but most importantly for authors, the feeling that this is something that journals were able to accept, and so it would be good for their research. And a second really critical thing that I'll highlight is that funders have really considered how important preprints are. So the Wellcome Trust, which is the biggest funder of medical research in the UK, did two things. Well, first of all, it started a journal where preprints were sort of built into the system. But it also has made this requirement in 2019 that if you are doing research on, say, an emerging epidemic such as Ebola, or were we to have another flu pandemic, they actually require that preprints are part of the publication of that research. So that makes a very substantial difference to the adoption of preprints. And I think we'll see increasing amounts of it happening. And now, of course, we know that in many areas, preprints are simply normal. And I would say that, the Indonesian preprint server in arXiv is a great example of that, of it becoming part of normal practice, which is sort of what we want to see. Okay. But then just to take a little bit of a step back, I want to highlight one thing, which is that it is very important to be careful about making publishing choices nowadays. I showed a slide earlier of the real complexity of publishing nowadays, and I talked to lots of academics, and I know that there is a lot of anxiety about how to navigate your way through the publishing world. So I just want to highlight this one site. There are others, but I think this one is particularly good, and it's called Think, Check, Submit. It's run by a coalition of publishing and other organizations, and it is as simple as going through those three steps. And the first one is, the most important one I always say to anybody is, do you actually know the journal? Have you published there? Have your colleagues published there? Have you talked to somebody about this research? And it's worrying to me often that people who do end up being published in journals that are not trustworthy have not been able to get advice that they needed. So the first part of it is, seek advice, particularly from librarians, particularly from your colleagues, and make sure that when you submit to a journal, it's not because they asked you to submit. You're submitting because you know that it's a journal that you are aware of and want to publish to. Now, of course, the opposite side to that is that there is a lot of innovation in publishing happening, and so you don't want to not publish in places that are new and exciting just because you've never heard of them before. But you need to do your proper research on them. So the next step is this checking step, particularly again coming back to, do your colleagues know this? I won't go through all these questions here, but one really nice way of understanding whether or not a journal or a new initiative is trustworthy is whether it's part of a recognized industry initiative. And the expectation there in many ways around the transparency for your research, the expectation is this transparency of the journal and its processes. And then this final point is that, well, only if you can answer yes to all the previous questions you should submit. The one point that I would emphasize to you is this last one, is that as a researcher, you have an absolute expectation. You should expect that your work is handled professionally when it's submitted to a journal or to any new publishing venue, and there are ways to manage that if that does not happen to you. There are industry bodies such as the Committee on Publication Ethics, which is the organisation that I used to be the chair of, that do work to help develop good standards across journals. So I hope that you have good publishing experiences, and you should expect that wherever you choose to publish. Okay, so I'm now going to go on to talk about metadata. So metadata is an incredibly important part of research. So it's very simply defined. It's information about an object, or it might be an individual. And the key part, and why it's so important, is because it underpins all of the new discoveries that I've been talking about, and it really is the core part of making research discoverable, citable, reusable, and accessible in the very long term, not just now, but into the future. Now, I talked about this a little bit earlier. It's part of this framework for open science, is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And if this isn't a term that you're familiar with in the past, I hope this is a term that you'll remember afterwards. And this is what it really looks like when you lay it out for publication. So there's these metadata that we have at the top, and I will talk a little bit more about them in a moment, the DOIs, the ORCID. We have repositories and journals, which are the way that you actually get to the research that's been published, or the data, or whichever kind of research output we're talking about. The interoperable part of it is this the format that you hold your research in, or your data, and then the reusable part is laid out and is defined by the Creative Commons licenses, and I'll show those again in a moment. And you can see I'm coming back time and time again to similar themes, which is all of these types of they're really core parts that underpin good publishing, good research practices, and they are, you'll come across them at lots of different stages of the research publishing life cycle. So the two most important ones are these two, which is the ORCID identifier and the digital object identifier. So the ORCID identifier is for you, it's for an individual, and it's one that you carry throughout your research life cycle, and you keep with it throughout your life. So for example, if you marry and change your name, your ORCID would stay the same. If you move institutions, it stays the same. And then on the right-hand side is this digital object identifier, which we heard about earlier. And this is a persistent digital identifier for objects. And it's incredibly important because we know that, for example, web links, URLs decay pretty rapidly after they've been put online, usually within about 2 to 3 years after publication of a URL. something like 50% of them are no longer available. So DOIs ensure that you don't lose it means that you can permanently find objects once they've been published. And again, just a sort of bit of a caution for you is that you should never be publishing or submitting to any journal or any other site where they don't, for example, make sure that you have a DOI for that for what you submit. It's quite a good part of ensuring reasonable quality. And both of these are really critical metadata, descriptive data for open research. And the other really important one that I would just highlight are these licenses, Creative Commons licenses. Creative Commons is an international organisation. We have a chapter in Australia and there are chapters across the world. And the most important thing about the licenses is that first of all, that you can choose which one suits you, from the most liberal, which is one called the Creative Commons Attribution License. This is the one noted up here, through to ones that, for example, restricts the rights, commercial rights. All of these are well described on the Creative Commons site. But critically, licenses don't just tell a human what you can do with a piece of work. They tell a machine. So there are three layers to the licenses. There's the human readable part, which says my research is licensed in this way and you can use it in any of the ways under the terms of the agreement. There's a more complex legal code, which only comes into force, for example, if there's a dispute, perhaps. But then underneath all of this is the machine readable part. And this is the part that goes on, is read when you're doing, for example, a complex literature search, or when there's machine doing a sort of very large data analysis. This will make it very clear what can be done with a particular research object. And all of these are absolutely critical, really, for the licenses to function correctly. And there's a lot of information on these sites, on the Creative Commons sites. I put the Australian ones here, but there are many other ones available in a number of different languages. And it's worth spending a little time understanding these, so you really know how you can use these to make sure that your research is shared in the way that you want it to be shared. And then the point about all of this is because the metadata really help you connect research. So this is a paper that I'm rather fond of. It's a paper on penguins in Antarctica, and it's from one of a PhD student who was based at QUT. And he generated a great deal of data. He got his PhD out of this, and he had a number of publications. But what you have, for example, is that the ORCID essentially uniquely identifies him as the author of each of these pieces of research. The DOI also tells you how all these articles and research outputs are linked together. So they're not exactly the same DOI because they're different objects. So one is the data, one is the publication, and one is his thesis. The Creative Commons license tells you exactly what you can do with this research. So, for example, the data here is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution License, which means it can be used in any way provided that the original author is credited. And there are some other important layers on top of this, such as Crossmark, which tells you exactly which version of a paper you're looking at, and that can only function if you have a DOI and you have the correct version and that's correctly marked. And then Crossref is an infrastructure that lies underneath all of this that links citations together. So all of these are really important, and these help you put data, publications, and research together. And this is also true for example, in clinical research. So this is a very important study that was done and funded by the National Institutes of Health Research in the UK. And instead of having just a publication site where you view the paper, this is actually the project report at the NIHR, the National Institutes for Health Research, and it has the protocol, has the paper and the data, and then there's underneath this there is the impact of the research. And this is a really great example, because this was a very important paper that had long-term effects for not just for health services, but also for individuals, and all of the information on this is collected together in one site. Okay, I'm going to move on to talking about changing incentives now. So why does this matter? Well, the first thing, and Samin indicated this and Brian talked about it as well, which is that we have a problem at the moment, which is that in most countries globally, the primary way that researchers are rewarded for doing research is through, or recognized for doing research, is through the journal that they're published in. And this leads to some unfortunate effects, one of which is that people chase publication in specific journals rather than concentrating on the underlying research or the underlying research practices. And in Australia, for example, and in a number of other countries, this is also important at universities because it ties into ranking systems. And so it's a complicated system. It leads to unfortunate effects, and it means that you don't, instead of valuing the whole of the research, you value just the publication in a specific place. So there are a number of initiatives that are going on to try and change this now. And the first one of which is, I'd just like to draw your attention to, is called DORA. So this is the Declaration on Research Assessment. I'm actually the chair of its International Advisory Group. And in that capacity, I would just say I'm extremely happy to hear from anybody that would like to know more about this for their specific context. We've been talking about this for a long time, the concept that we need to think about changing incentives away from the journals. When I worked at the Public Library of Science, we did a fair bit of work to develop what were called article level metrics, which were measures of individual citations of articles, not just of the journal, social media reach of articles, other methods of indicating how the research was used. But since that time, the DORA, the Declaration on Research Assessment, which was a group of journals coming together originally in San Francisco, so you'll sometimes hear this called the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, have come together to try and crystallize into a really small number of principles what we'd like to see happen. And so the first one really is that the scientific content of the paper is important than where it was published. And so all of the types of things that Brian and Samina were talking about before really play into this. So, how good was the quality of the data? Did you pre-register it? How good was your analysis? All of this should be considered when you're looking at the quality of a research, not just where it ended up being published. And of course, as we heard earlier, just where papers get published does not indicate how that they are necessarily good quality, and a number of those papers simply can't be reproduced. So the journal itself is not a marker of quality. The second key principle is that all research output should be valued. So that means the data set behind the research, the software that was used to generate it, and indeed, any other methods that were part of the research itself. Until quite recently, we didn't have a systematic way of being able to cite research data, but that now is being developed, and there's some good work going on by Barbour, who's based at Harvard, who has done some really nice work on, particularly in clinical research, coming up with a standardized method of sharing data and citing it, which will allow researchers to get proper credit for it, because this has been a real key problem behind data sharing until quite recently, which was that if you don't get credit for making data available, it's very hard to incentivize researchers to do that. And then the final principle is that coming back to the journal-based metrics, such as journal impact factors, shouldn't be used as a surrogate measure of the quality of the individual research articles. And even more than that, they should not be used as a surrogate measure of the quality of the individual researcher. It's very clear that we know that people do good research, people can do less good research, and what is not the case is that where the paper is published in the end is necessarily a good indicator of what an individual research article in that journal, how good it is. So this leads to some difficult questions, because it means, for example, that of course you have to read articles quite closely. It's not good enough to just assume that because a paper was published in a particular journal that it is necessarily good quality. All the work that Brian and Samina and others have been doing in developing these different models of quality, so pre-registration, etc., do help you give different measures of being able to indicate how good quality research is. But where the article is published on its own is not something that we should be doing really going forward. And this was really reinforced for me very clearly earlier this year at a conference in Hong Kong, the World Congress on Research Integrity, which is a conference that in the past has been, has a great focus, for example, on managing publication misconduct and research misconduct. This year there was a great focus on the importance of open science and its role in research integrity more generally. And you'll see here, this is the FAIR principles, the findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable principles for data were specifically mentioned as being important, as were open practices more generally. And I want to just direct you to a particular preprint which is up on OSF at the moment, which I'm one of the authors of, which talks about can we do better in actually thinking about how we might assess researchers rather than doing it just on journal publications. In Australia, it's quite interesting. This has become a topic of great interest to our research funders, in particular our National Health and Medical Research Council, and to our chief scientist, who have been talking about this at quite some length recently. And so we're very heartened that this has become part of the conversation in Australia. So what are the Hong Kong principles? Well, there's 5, and I'd encourage you to have a look at this preprint and to very much welcome your comments on it. The first one is that we want to assess researchers on responsible practice all the way through their research. So all of the types of other practices that you've heard of today, these are the types of good practices, the registration, etc. We'd like to be seeing that, and that should be something that researchers are assessed on and recognised for. The second principle is the importance of being accurate and transparent about reporting all of the research. And again, it's key that pre-registration is utterly important to this, and I think will become increasingly important as research gets more complex and projects get more complex. The third principle is around open research practices more generally. So everything from open data, open access publishing, or even open peer review, if that's something that's accepted within your research discipline, again, should be specifically recognized as being valuable. And the fourth principle is the idea of, as we move to more complex areas of research, it's not always a research publication that is the final output of that research. So what other research and scholarship should be valued? And that's, for example, might be generating data sets or writing code, for example, not necessarily simple research publications. And the fifth principle is around valuing other contributions to responsible research that are often forgotten about, such as participating in peer review, mentoring, knowledge exchange, particularly out to beyond academia into the general public, and into sort of collaboration more widely. And we hope that these principles will resonate with a large range of groups, individuals, universities, and funders globally, and hopefully will spark conversations about generation of new ways of rewarding research. Okay, so very quickly, I'll just talk to you about some good news. So this is perhaps to reassure you that many of the practices that we've been talking about do actually benefit both researchers, but also have a benefit to society more generally. So the first parts I'll just talk about are the increased readership and the increased citation that's associated with open access. So on the left-hand side here, you have a top line which shows number of citations for number of downloads for open papers, and on the bottom is the number of downloads for closed papers. And this was a sort of natural experiment that was done at one journal at a time when they actually happened to have a set of journals, a set of papers that were open, a set of papers that were closed. And you can see there's quite a dramatic difference between the open and closed papers. On the right-hand side, I won't go through all what the different colours mean, but if you just look at the dotted line versus this the solid line, the average number of citations associated with open access papers of all types is 1.18. For all papers, it's 1.0, and then for the closed articles, which are the ones in grey, it's 0.9. And this open access citation advantage has been repeatedly shown now across a number of different disciplines and geographically. The same is true for books. So we know that books have an increased readership, which would seem perhaps to be an obvious finding, but I think needs to be demonstrated. And it is particularly true for open access monographs, which compared to closed monographs have often had a very small readership. Open access monographs have a dramatically higher readership compared to their closed ones. The same is true, they have an increased number of citations, 50% more, and more online mentions. So this again is great for authors of work that is obviously, complex and long term, and it's important that the making them open does actually is associated with high usage of all types. It's interesting to note that open access is associated with increased inclusion in secondary sources. So, for example, Wikipedia, which we do know is the most important source of technical, when anybody types a sort of slightly technical term into into a search engine, Wikipedia generally comes up first. Open access papers are more likely to be cited on Wikipedia, and of course, any of these pages of Wikipedia get a vastly higher readership compared to a general article. Same is true for media coverage. We know that journalists like open papers. It helps them to provide better coverage of the research and generally leads to more coverage of that research as well. And just a couple of things to end with, that preprints we know actually see an increased citation rate of the final published article, which is associated if there's a preprint for that paper. So about 70% of preprints end up being published in fully peer-reviewed journals, and those final peer-reviewed journals get cited about there's an associated increase in citations of about 1.53. Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon, 1.31 for the citations. Increased attention score is 1.53. And for data sharing, a very large study across a group of open journals at Biomed Central and the Public Library of Science showed that if data was linked to their supporting data was linked to a research publication, there was a 25% increase in citations for those papers, which is perhaps not unexpected, but I was quite surprised to see how high the increase in citations was, and indicates that there's a not just a sort of citations are really quite perhaps being done for in-depth reasons. So not just a citation of a sort in a superficial way, but obviously, but with some sort of quite in-depth work being done on those papers post-publication. I'll leave you with this as a little icon, as a way of thinking about some tools that you might want to take on board if you're as you're thinking about open research. So The most important ones I'd highlight are the ORCID, which is your identifier as a researcher, the concept of making research fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, the importance of making good publishing choices, the think, check, submit, the concept of thinking about real impact, not just where journal publications occur, and then something I haven't touched on, which is there's methods to access open research, and then there are some very useful tools that have been developed, which are available freely for anyone to use. I've put some examples here of places you can keep up to date with open scholarship. Some are Australian, but a number of them are Australasian, Indonesian. And I have to thank Sandy and others for their links to these. And I would encourage you to look at any of these if you are interested. There's a great deal, a very vibrant online community globally on open scholarship more generally. So thank you very much. I'm very happy to take questions, and obviously either now or in the later time, please do follow up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ginny. Mari kita beri tepuk tangan yang meriah untuk Ginny. Thank you so much. So, we've got a few questions, but unfortunately, we've just about run out of time. I've got one core question to ask you, Ginny.
Okay.
So I think, especially in Indonesia's academia, a lot of the stage that we're at is we're trying to get a lot of our journals indexed, to get a lot of our journals recognized. And so how can we do that? And at the same time, do preprints actually detract from that? Does the existence of preprints, because I think this is a question on a lot of people's minds, does the existence of preprints or the use of preprints actually make it more difficult to make quality journals?
No, it doesn't. So I think they're completely separate. So preprints, well, first off to say is it is important that preprints are important, that they should themselves be good quality. So I note that the in-archive is based at OSF, so it gives it credibility. You want to be sure that preprint servers themselves have good credibility, so good that there's a process behind how they're managed and that they are well done and properly organized. Journals themselves do have to go through a process to get indexed. I absolutely understand I understand the point that there are real barriers, particularly with non-English language journals getting indexed, and I think that's a problem. This is one of the issues that the Directory of Open Access Journals is trying to address, and I didn't have enough time to talk about that too much. I didn't mention it specifically because I wanted to focus on OA, not just OA journals. Yes, there is a process to go through. I think that the DOAJ are beginning to try and unpack what are the issues that have to happen for non-English language journals. And I think what we need to see is much more happening from outside of the English language world to understand what is good quality and how you can get into these sites. I think that the fact that they're primarily dominated often by North American, European journals is highly problematic. So I would encourage you to look at sites like the Committee on Publication Ethics, which has examples of good practice, and there are a number of other editorial places that you can go to look for good practices, and I'm happy to follow up on that.
Absolutely, thank you. So I recently just got two very, very good questions, and so I think we'll just do a super quick fire questions if that's okay.
Sure.
So the first one is, in a lot of places, in order to publish in open access journals, you've got to pay a fee.
Yep.
Now, that actually becomes extremely expensive in an Indonesian context. So what are some of the ways you think what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, I'll go through, I'll talk two things to that. So the first is to say that you don't have to publish an open access journal to make your work open access. You can do it via a repository. So most universities in Australia, for example, well, all universities in Australia have a repository. I'm afraid I don't know the situation in Indonesia, but the green open access, the repository-based open access, is absolutely fine way of making your research open, and it complies with most policies globally and certainly in where I am in Australia nationally. The second thing to note is that you may have heard of a big initiative that has come out of Europe called Plan S, which is a big funder-led initiative to make research open. And one of the key principles for that is that the costs of article processing charges should not be borne by individual authors, that we want to see a future where we have transformative agreements and the costs of publishing, as now where universities and funders pay subscription costs, they in the future will be paying for the entirety of the publication charges, and it'll be done on a consortial level. And our expectation is that that will happen on national and perhaps even international levels. And so you're absolutely right, this has to stop being the case that individual authors have to pay the article processing charges. But at the same time, I would encourage you to look at the directory of open access journals. They list the article processing charge for every journal that's listed there, and more than 70% of those journals do not have an article processing charge. So it's not an absolute given.
Yep, no worries. I think that's about as much time as we'll have. So everyone, let's give Ginny a huge round of applause. Thank you so much for speaking to us today, Ginny.
Thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate that.
No worries, everyone. So just to close off, we're